All right, welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're skipping the daily headlines and diving straight into the actual strategic board state of the US-Iran conflict. We're going to unpack a really fascinating, high-level strategic briefing based on the work of military historian Victor Davis Hanson. Our goal here is purely analytical. We want to map out the data, the timelines, and the tactical maneuvers that are driving both sides of this massive standoff right now.
We're going to break this down into 5 key phases: the 14-day stalemate, competing political strategies, the domestic economic catalyst, the final military phase, and the Israel deterrence factor. Let's get into it.
Part 1, the 140-day stalemate, and where the conflict stands today. So, to figure out where we're going, we really need to look at how we got here. The timeline is actually pretty striking. Day 1 was that initial attack on February 28th. Now, a lot of people loosely call this a continuous war, but in reality, it was only about 40 days of actual full-scale bombing. After that 40-day mark, the whole dynamic shifted entirely. We rolled right into a 100-day stretch of negotiations, which have just been punctuated by these sporadic tit-for-tat exchanges of missiles and drones. And here's the real kicker that Hanson points out about this 100-day stretch. He argues these proportional, tit-for-tat strikes have essentially been a complete failure when it comes to achieving strategic objectives. I mean, they've been totally ineffectual. They haven't stopped the missile barges from threatening the Gulf states, they certainly haven't secured the vital Strait of Hormuz, and crucially, the U.S. still has zero control over Iran's enriched uranium. It's basically a massive geopolitical stalemate. Moving on to Part 2, competing political strategies. Midterms versus the clock. You know, military maneuvers are almost always driven by domestic politics behind the scenes, and this situation is a textbook example. Just look at the competing playbooks here. For the U.S. administration, the goal is pretty straightforward: prevent Iran from getting nuclear or widespread missile capabilities and keep that Strait of Hormuz open. But they are on a massive ticking clock. They absolutely need to wrap up operations rapidly to protect their control of Congress in the upcoming midterms. If they lose the House or Senate, their whole domestic agenda stalls out and the risk of impeachment proceedings goes way up. Now flip over to Iran's strategy. It's the exact opposite. Their whole game plan is just running out the clock. They want to drag this conflict out, absorb those proportional hits, and basically hold on until the U.S. midterms. If control of the U.S. Congress flips, Iran is hoping the funding for this conflict just dries up entirely, letting them wait things out for a potentially more favorable U.S. administration in 2028.
Part 3, the domestic economic catalyst, the numbers driving the timeline. Okay, to really grasp the intense political pressure on the U.S. administration right now, you just need this one historical fact. In 39 out of the last 41 midterms, the out party gained ground. 39 out of 41. History is heavily stacked against the incumbent. The administration obviously knows this historical reality, but they actually think they have a narrow window to upset that trend.
And that optimism comes straight from current economic indicators. Look at these numbers detailed in Hanson's briefing. Unemployment is sitting right around 4.2%. GDP growth is solid at 2.3 to 2.4%. Month-to-month inflation is hovering near historic lows, and the stock market is still riding high. Basically, the analysis suggests the full effects of recent tax cuts, re-regulation, and foreign investment are finally hitting. So the administration's bet is this: if they can rapidly and definitively win this conflict in Iran, these strong domestic numbers will actually carry them through the midterms. But again, that whole plan totally hinges on ending the stalemate right now. Which brings us to Part 4, the final military phase, and moving to a disproportionate response.
Because that proportional tit-for-tat approach completely failed to yield results, the analysis points toward a dramatic shift in tactical doctrine. The big takeaway here? Measured responses are completely off the table. Hanson argues that because those negotiations just allowed Iran to survive and keep threatening the region, the absolutely only way to break this deadlock on such a compressed timeline is to go unmeasured and disproportionate. It's a total 180-degree pivot from the strategy of the last 100 days.
So what does that actually look like? Well, it breaks down into a really aggressive 3-step military escalation plan. Step 1 is a massive 1 to 2 week blitz specifically designed to completely destroy Iran's military capabilities. We're talking targeting the industrial complex, missile launchers, drone fields, and wiping out their anti-aircraft systems near the strait. Now, if Iran doesn't concede after that, step 2 kicks in, a 1-week campaign hitting dual-use targets. This means going after the power grids and bridges to just totally incapacitate their infrastructure. And finally, step 3 is the pivot. Once Iran is essentially militarily inert, the U.S. declares victory, outsources the defense of the region to its allies, and brings the primary forces back home to focus on the U.S. economy.
But within this intense bombing campaign, there is a very specific contingency plan for Iran's nuclear ambitions. Hanson notes that B-2 bombers would be deployed to hit highly fortified locations. We're talking about deeply buried sites like Pickaxe Mountain and suspected enriched uranium facilities. And there's even a noted contingency for July 2025. If intel shows a nuclear program is still operating underground, B-2s will be sent in to neutralize those facilities. The source points out that Iranian air defenses are pretty anemic when matched up against advanced Western tech like that.
Now, remember step 3 of that plan, the pivot to allies? Well, that whole strategy leans heavily on one specific number, 600. Allied forces in the Gulf currently possess roughly 600 frontline combat aircraft. The logic here is that once the U.S. drastically reduces Iran's offensive power, those 600 Allied jets, backed up by U.S. frigates and rotating carriers, are going to be more than enough to maintain regional stability and keep the Strait of Hormuz open, without the U.S. needing a massive, endless ground presence.
And finally, Part 5, the Israel deterrence factor, the geopolitical wildcard.
Looking at this whole regional chessboard, there is one glaring tactical anomaly that we absolutely have to address. Just look at the recent activity. Iran has been boasting almost daily about hitting Oman, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. These are Muslim nations fighting a fellow Muslim nation, and yet they are strictly avoiding any attack on Israel, a country they literally refer to as an existential enemy. So you have to ask, why on earth is Iran perfectly willing to tangle with its neighbors, but completely unwilling to launch a direct strike on Israel right now? Well, according to the briefing, it all comes down to sheer, overwhelming deterrence. See, while the U.S. and Iran have been stuck in that tit-for-tat loop, Israel has spent the last 4.5 months resting its military and completely restocking munitions. On top of that, they boast a superior intelligence apparatus that has deeply, deeply infiltrated the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and their military infrastructure. They know exactly where the leadership lives, where they travel, and Israel has made it crystal clear, if attacked, they are not going to just hit back proportionally. They've threatened to systematically target the 4th, 5th, and 6th tiers of Iranian leadership. So Iran is effectively terrified that getting dragged into a two-front war against both the U.S. and a fully rested Israel would result in damage they literally could not recover from.
Which brings us to a pretty heavy final thought to ponder for today's explainer. We've just seen how proportional, measured responses basically led to a 140-day stalemate. But at the same time, the mere threat of a wildly disproportionate, highly targeted response from Israel has completely frozen Iranian aggression on that specific front. So, when you step back and look at the stark realities of international military power dynamics presented here, you kind of have to ask yourself, in the unforgiving arena of geopolitics, is overwhelming, disproportionate deterrence the only true currency of peace? It's a harsh question, for sure, but understanding the board state means facing these strategic realities head-on. All right, thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.